I'd like to talk just for a little bit about writing to the debug window. So let's create an application and play around with that a bit. We'll do a couple of things with just output in general, but in the context of writing to the debug window. So I'll create a new project, and it will be a console application as before. And this would be demo for debug write line, or any of the routines that write to the debug window. We have our code here. And of course, we can add output. We can write to the console object some text. And of course, that shows up on the console window. In other words, it looks like this. This is the startup project. So there's the text. Hello. And it comes out to the console window, as you see there. Now, there are times when we would like to write something out, but we don't necessarily want the user of the executable to see it. And in general, what we're doing there is for developing the application. So this would go to the debug window. So if you go to debug, Windows, you can see that there's an output window there. And I bring that up, and of course right now it's blank. So what I want to do is I want to be able to write to that window. And the way you do that is something from system.diagnostics.debug. And then there's a write, and as you can see, there's several of these here. So there's a write and a write if and a write line and sort of the standard stuff that you would expect to be able to use to output text. So I'll just mostly be just using a write line and occasionally a write, perhaps, just like we are doing with the console window. Let's put in a write line, and we can write something out here. And it runs the application. And if we go back to the debug window, there you can see the line that I asked to have written out. Hello to the debug window. Okay, so in other words, one thing to remember is that anytime you're writing to the debug window, you have to run the program through the debugger or you won't see that output. And as you can see, we're through with the application. In other words, it's exited, but the data that we wrote out is still in the window. If for whatever reason that was more of an issue and you did need to stop the application and look at the output, you can always put a breakpoint. So in the extreme left-hand corner of the text there, you see this this area right here, that gray column. If you click in that area, it'll create a breakpoint. So in this case, I put the breakpoint on line 14, and then I rerun. In other words, I execute this with F5, which is the same as debug, start debugging. Okay, then it will actually stop on that line, and as you can see in the debug output window, which is again down here, there's no text there yet because we haven't actually executed this line. So let's go ahead and do a step and execute that line, F11, and then we'll execute the line, and then you'll actually see your hello to the debug window. Okay, so that's how you get output to that window. You use system.diagnostics.debug.write or write line to get that information out. And again, to write to the output window, you actually have to use the debugger. In other words, you have to go through the debugger. So even though this is a console application, you would be debugging. In this case, I'm starting. If I already started, so let me stop it. You need to go through start debugging rather than start without debugging if you want to see that output. Okay, but again, it will still be there even after the console application has exited. So it's not like you have to catch it as it's executing. All right, I'm going to remove this breakpoint for now. And let's look at some other ways that you can write to the debug window or other things to know about it. The first is, you'll note that it is in the namespace system.diagnostics. So in this case, we're only doing one write or debug.write line. So maybe it's okay to leave the namespace in there like that. But remember, if you want to shorten that, you can always add a using directive. And it's actually giving me some help about some of this stuff. I'm going to go ahead and put that here. This is my using directive, using system.diagnostics. Okay, and that means I can remove that namespace reference, like so. So the next thing is I might want to write variable values out, or in other words, something other than just a string. So let me create a number, and I'll call it 10, and I'll set it equal to 10. Too tricky there. And I want to write that value out. How do I do that? Well, if we're dealing with a console window, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You could just say plus and then 10, and it will write both of those things out. Okay, and let's take a look at what that looks like. There it is. Okay, so that's what it looks like in the console window. Hello, 10. And this is fine if that's all the control over the output that you need, but often we need more control. So what we can do is we can use what are called format specifiers. And so, for example, I can put in curly brace 0 curly brace, and then instead of saying plus 10, I'm going to put a comma there. And what this says is take a look at that number, and in this case it's 0, and it's the curly braces, of course, that alert us that we're going to be getting a value after the comma. That's positional. In other words, C# being just like C++ and C, everything starts at 0. So what they're saying is in the 0th position after the format string, and this is the format string, take this variable and place it in that location. And then that would look like this. Somewhat anticlimactic, although there is a space there. I guess it makes it a little bit different. But for the most part, it looks exactly the same. Well, you can use format specifiers with the DebugWrite line statements, or the write line method as well. So, for example, I can say, comma, 10, and then I will put my format specifier in the same place, let's say. And then when we run the code, and again, remember you have to go through the debugger, so F5. And if you go down and look at the debug window, you will see it says hello 10 to the debug window. So in other words, the same sort of format specifiers you can use with console.writeLine, you can also use with debug.writeLine. Now, having said that, there are a couple of things to be aware of. The first is that right now I've got a string as my format string, my first parameter, and then a number or an int. In other words, something that isn't a string. Let's take a look at what happens if we create a string like so, and we make that the parameter. Put that in both of those spots. Okay. Rather than starting, we can just step into, in other words, execute the code one line at a time. So if we go up to debug, there's something called step into, and as you can see, the hotkey for that is F11. Okay, so I'm going to use that. So F11 to step into, and I execute one line of code at a time. And then I get down to the console write line, and let's bring up the console here. And you can see that it has executed the line that causes hello Kevin to be written to the console window. All right, good. We haven't executed the debug line yet, so let's go ahead and go back to Visual Studio and do that. F11. And if you go back and you look at the output window for that console, or that debug.write line, it says Kevin : hello curly brace 0 curly brace to the debug window. So in other words, it's not the output we expected. The reason for that, it's because of the way the debug window actually works. So it's not exactly the same as console.writeLine. So if you have that situation where you want to have a format string and then a string, but only that as a parameter, you need to alert the compiler that what you wanted there was not that behavior, and you actually want to treat this as a parameter. So basically, in order to call the right version, you have to put a dummy parameter in. Because if you put anything as a parameter list other than 2 strings, it knows basically what to do. But if you give it 2 strings, it makes an assumption. It kind of makes your output look funky. So if I give it any other parameter list, it'll be fine. And so now let's go ahead and restart this, like so. And now if you look at the output, hello Kevin to the debug window, which is exactly what I wanted. Again, if you want to write out to the debug window a format string, and then the variables you want to write out is itself a string, you can just add a dummy parameter. Okay, so that's one possibility. There is another possibility, and that is you can use different form of the output that doesn't require these positional parameters. So you can do this with the console window too. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to put a $sign in front of it. And then instead of putting a positional parameter, I'm going to actually put the name of the variable that I want written out. Okay, and I can do that as well with the debug window. So again, I get rid of the positional parameter, and then I don't need to put an additional parameter afterwards. So basically, the compiler just compiles it differently. And so now when you run this, I'm going to run it with F11 again, one step at a time. So if we go to the console window, we can see that that is working as we would expect it to work. So that's good. Go back to Visual Studio and F11 again. And there's the DebugWrite line. And if we look down here, we can see that the debug window now has the output in it that we want. First thing you could do is just add a dummy parameter. The second thing you could do is put in a $sign in front of the string. And there's a third thing that will also be useful in other situations where instead of using the format parameter for console write line or debug write line, you can use the string version. So in other words, you could say string.format and then put in your format string, which in this case would look something like this. I guess I should put hello in front of it to be consistent. Okay, and then you're not depending upon the way debug.writeLine or debug.write for that matter works. And so then you would take this string, so I will capture that string, and I'll call that my format string. And I will take this, I need to type it first as a string. We'll take this, and I will place it here. And I can do the same thing with DebugWriteLine. And again, don't be confused. String.format is for more than just dealing with debug.writeLine. It's anytime you want to construct a string before you write it out. But at any rate, it will work with both console.writeLine and debug.writeLine. And it is also a way around the problem that if you give debug.writeLine two string parameters, it doesn't work as you would probably expect it to work. What we just did was we showed that, of course, you can write information out to the console window using console write or writeLine. You can also use debug.write or writeLine. If you use debug, of course, it goes to the debug window, and that's in the namespace system.diagnostics. And if you do have a format string that takes first parameter, or the 0th parameter, if you like, as a string, and you want to write that out to the debug window, just be aware that you either need to create a dummy parameter or use the $sign, the leading $sign approach on the format string, or use string.format. So one of those approaches. Okay, so that's a little information about debug.write. And then we can use that in our applications to write out information that doesn't need to go to the user, which is to say, in our case, the console window, but instead is for the developer, the person creating the code.